As I reflect on my presentation on dynamic systems and then also teach my graduate school course on motor learning sport pedagogy that's based on an ecological dynamics approach to motor learning, one of the things that I think continues to be confused or misused is the idea of constraints and how it applies to coaching. And so it's not that the constraints aren't there in isolated or block practice, but that those constraints are different. And as the quote I got from Rafe Kelly, complex transfers to simplicity, but not vice versa. So when we're talking about the task, individual, and environmental constraints with the skills, so let's take shooting. So if I'm shooting in a gym by myself, and I know I catch and I shoot, and let's say I do the same shot 10 times in a row with somebody rebounding and passing it to me. I'm the designated shooter. There are a few task constraints. There are task constraints in terms of me shooting the ball. There are some environmental constraints in terms of the lighting in the gym and the type of floor and so forth. And then there's the individual constraints that I bring to the task. But those are fairly simple compared to the task constraints that I may face in a game when there's going to be defense, greater speed, intensity, time, score, pressure, social pressure could be an environmental constraint in that from that standpoint. So the game constraints then are far more complex, and so the task constraints in a game, the complex task constraints, will ultimately tend to lead to better performance in simpler situations, such as shooting by myself in a gym. But the simple tasks do not necessarily transfer to better performance in the complex. So I think that's one thing that is somewhat misused as we think of the task constraints only being in a game. There are task constraints upon my shooting when I'm shooting by myself in terms of how I receive the ball, where the pass is, the location of the shot, some of these things. They're just more simple than the task constraints of a game, and so therefore the transfer may not be there in terms of improving performance in a game from isolated block practice. So there's always task constraints. Every time we perform a skill or repeat a skill, it's the interaction of the environment of the task and the individual constraints, that act upon the performance of that skill. However, those task constraints especially will change from repetition to repetition, situation to situation, and the more complex situations or the more complex the task, the less a more simple practice will transfer to that situation. So I don't think, and I may have misspoke in certain ways, but I don't think that it's the lack of task constraints available in an isolated practice, but it's that those task constraints are far more simple compared to the task constraints in the game, and we need to encourage more practice in the complex situations to improve the transfer to game performance.